how there is an absolute difference between being in the present moment and being lost in thought. See, there is a deep connection between, of course, the nature of the mind and the nature of happiness. Mind oscillates between the past and the future. Well, that is mind. By definition, this oscillation is mind. Now, where is the experience of happiness in a mind that is constantly oscillating? Because there is happiness. It is something we experience all the time and we know it exists. And yet, happiness doesn't belong to the present moment. It belongs to this oscillating mind. Let me give an example to try and understand the source of happiness. Let's say you wake up in the morning and there's a cup of coffee on the table. Either your wife has prepared or your husband has prepared, if that is possible. And you drink the cup of coffee and you realize that it is colder than normal. You like it hot, but this time the cup of coffee is cold. And immediately there is a response to that experience. You are a little agitated, you are angry, and you express that anger, telling that, this coffee is not hot. I mean, I always like the coffee to be hot. Now, the next day, there is another cup of coffee, and this time you are expecting the coffee to be cold for some reason because of the previous day's experience. And this time you pick up the coffee and you drink, and it's the perfect temperature, the temperature that you like. And there is a moment of happiness. Now, in this whole episode, where is happiness? Is it in the coffee? Is it in the coffee maker? Is it in the cup? Or is it in your mouth? Where is the experience of happiness? See, happiness is not an elusive concept somewhere that is out there in the world that you need to pull towards yourself. Happiness is a very simple experience. So in this exercise, happiness is neither in the cup, nor in the taste, nor in the person who's prepared the coffee. Happiness is simply hidden in your expectation. In fact, happiness is nothing but another phase of expectation. So the first time when you drank that cup of coffee, there was already an inbuilt expectation in you that the coffee is going to be hot. When it turned out to be cold, the response was unhappiness. So what was that cause of unhappiness? It is not the coffee, but your expectation of how the coffee is supposed to be. Now, throughout the day, this is what plays along in every experience. Unconsciously, we have picked up a lot of expectations about who we are, about the nature of people around us, about our social interactions, about the society. These expectations have become a part of our daily living. So when the events that support those experiences happen, you're happy. And if an event happens that doesn't support those experiences, then you're sad, you're unhappy. The point I'm trying to make is happiness is not the highest goal of a human being. Happiness is very simple moment-to-moment response to your expectations. In fact, it is impossible to completely eradicate pain and suffering from your life. It is impossible to only be happy all the time. Happiness is a very simple thing. Happiness is like the tickling of the mind. It is good once in a while, but if you're tickling it all the time, it's disturbing. And happiness is only concerned about the oscillating mind. It has nothing to do with the body, if you think about it. And somewhere we have built our society with the idea that happiness is the highest ideal. So there are people who go on preaching and teaching about how to be happy. And that is what we learn in the self-help books, and even some of the so-called spiritual teachers talk about happiness. It's as if happiness solves all our problems, and that is all what we are searching. In fact, if you ask me, happiness and misery are two legs of an individual. You need both to walk. If you choose only happiness and if you reject misery, then you will be limping all the while. It's not going to look good. See, the reason is obvious. Imagine, let's take a hypothetical scenario where you are absolutely obsessed about being happy all the time. In fact, that itself is enough to make you unhappy. Just you decide that you want to be happy for one whole day, then your mind will give you enough reasons to be unhappy. Remember, the mind is not with you, it is always against you. So, it's like if happiness is the objective, then what happens to those moments when you have to experience pain and suffering? For example, what happens when you hit your leg to the chair? What happens when your favorite team loses a match? What happens when you have to genuinely be sad? There's a part of you that goes into a conflict and it rejects all the other emotions because it now wants only to be happy. Now that itself is enough to cause a lot of pain and suffering. Accepting all emotions of life, accepting everything life throws at you with equal-minded acceptance is the whole essence of being alive and being alive in the moment. Not to choose between happiness and sadness. If there is happiness, we'll experience it. We'll laugh in that happiness. We'll rejoice in that happiness. If there is pain and suffering, we'll suffer in that suffering. Both complement the way of life. There is no contradiction between happiness and misery. But somehow, selling happiness has become a business. Whether you want it or not, there are people out there constantly trying to sell you this happiness. And in that way, I think we have grossly imbalanced our society and we have grossly imbalanced the individual. Because an individual who's constantly choosing to be happy is at the same time choosing to be miserable. It's like if you have to, if I can give an example, if you have to make pizza, you need the dough and you need the toppings. The dough of the pizza is all the pain, suffering, and all other emotions of life. And the toppings that you sprinkle on top of it are momentary happiness that you experience once in a while. Now imagine you try to create a pizza only using toppings. Firstly, you cannot create it. If you can create it, it's not going to taste good. There is a balance between pain and pleasure. There's a balance between happiness and misery. And that balance is the balance of life. And life itself knows how to take care of that balance. All we need to do is be willing to accept whatever life throws at us. See, now, what is the search? If happiness is not the highest objective, then what is a human being searching for? So what do we do with a moment like this? If we are only choosing happiness, what do we do with this disconnection of the line? It makes us sad. See, this is the whole essence of understanding the nature of happiness and misery. We have to accept both equally to be able to experience life in its completeness. So, if a happiness is not the highest quest of man, then what is it? The, the highest quest of man is certainty and bliss. And that is what we are searching for all the time. Okay, let's assume that happiness is the highest objective. If happiness is the highest objective, then why is somebody climbing Mount Everest? What happiness is he getting from climbing Mount Everest? If happiness is the highest objective, then what happiness is there in skydiving? What happiness is there in all the danger and thrill that an individual experiences in an adventure? There is no happiness in this. He's searching for something else. He's searching for certainty and that momentary bliss. Now, if we can just explore the nature of man's search, we'll see it very clearly that man is searching for a way to go beyond the pain of the body, the physical body, not the mind. And that is why there is so much of force and attraction towards sex, towards drugs, towards alcohol, because these things don't induce happiness in you, they induce a sense of bliss. Although momentarily, it is still a fact that these things have the ability to induce a sense of bliss. We tend to think that the society is driven by economics. It's not driven by economics, it's driven by sex. Without sex, without children being born, what economics are you talking about? But somehow we have become very hypocritical. We don't want to talk about sex, and the credit for that goes to religions. All religions have been against sex, which is a gross misunderstanding of the nature of reality. In the process of rejecting sex, they have rejected a simple, beautiful, innocent pleasure of man. And once you make such a simple thing so complicated, so difficult for people to accept, then naturally people start finding other ways of venting out that energy. And that's what we see in the world now. The one part of the society, so-called religious society, keeps abstaining itself from sex, and there's another part of the society that embraces sex, sometimes in a grossly, overtly, abusive way, because the balance is lost. There is a genuine need for the body that has to be understood, and this need is not happiness. Happiness is the desire of the mind, and more often than not, we don't have too much control over this happiness. Happiness is a moment of excitement. When it happens, we enjoy it. When it doesn't happen, we can let go of it. But the desires of the body is extremely strong. And more often than not, individuals are tormented by the desires of the body, not by the desires of the mind. See, that is why meditation is not an intellectual exercise. It is an actual physical journey into the deeper dimension of life. That is why the transformation that happens through meditation is absolute and complete, because it addresses the core bodily need of man. So what is this bliss? What is this certainty? See, whether we acknowledge it or not, we are constantly asking this one most important question. That is, who am I and what is life? And where do I fit in the scheme of things? Even if you don't articulate it in the same way, even if you don't express this the same way, you are asking this question in pretty much everything you do. Think about it. It's the same meaning that you're searching for at work. It's the same meaning you're searching for in relationships, in love. In all your human interactions, what you're searching for is the meaning for the mystery called you. Because you are the biggest mystery. And that is why there is so much of uncertainty in living. Moments of unhappiness are very easy to handle. But moments of not knowing, They are not even moments. Throughout your life, you live in a prison of not knowing. Not knowing who you are, not knowing why you are the way you are, not knowing your place in the world. That is more painful than unhappiness. So, how do you experience this certainty? How do you find this stable ground that you can call your home and operate from that space instead of being lost in the mind? Now, this is where being mindful, being meditation comes into the picture. And when the body starts to experience the bliss that is within it, then everything begins to fall into place. Now, think about it. If you're out somewhere taking a walk under the scorching sun, you're sweating profusely, and you're in a very uncomfortable situation physically, how creative, how intelligent, or how happy can you be in a moment like that? And how much of life's beauty and joy can you experience in a moment like that? When your body is not relaxed, when your body is in pain and suffering, all other possibilities of happiness, all other possibilities of searching for a higher ideal of life disappears. So the first thing that we need to understand is what we are searching for is not happiness but bliss. And bliss is within, it is not outside. And that is why it doesn't matter whether you are rich or poor. It doesn't matter whether you are successful or a failure. It doesn't matter whether you are famous or unknown. If you don't know yourself, you will be in pain. You will be in misery. And that is what we are seeing all around us. I mean, if going outward, going outside into the world could have brought us this certainty, then all successful people, all rich people should have been, happy all the time. But we see more instances of pain and suffering in the upper so-called echelons of the society than anywhere else. The reason is simple. The requirements of the body are totally different from the requirements of the mind. And through our education system, through our upbringing, through our nature of work, we have only nurtured, we have only spoken about the desires of the mind. We have completely ignored the desires of the body because somewhere religion has polluted the innocence of man by telling him that the desires of body is bad. The moment you say something is bad, you stop inquiring about it. You stop searching about it. You stop seeking answers for it. Only when you acknowledge the fact of the pulsating force and desire of the body can you begin your search. What is the source of suffering? See, suffering is, you can understand it at two levels. One is the suffering of the mind that constantly oscillates between the past and the future, and it picks up emotions and painful memories of the past and brings it to the present. That is one form of suffering. Another form of suffering is a subtle form of suffering which happens through the body. See, if you observe your body throughout the day from morning till evening, you will realize that body is in a way constantly in pain. That is the nature of the body itself. Escaping this pain is the greatest search of man. So root cause of suffering is kind of in the inherent nature of being itself. It's in the inherent nature of the mind and it's in the inherent nature of the body. So suffering is not something that is just imposed on a human being. As a part of the growing up process, we accumulate suffering. So we have to acknowledge that suffering is an absolute reality of life. And once we acknowledge it, there are of course different ways of going beyond suffering. Jacob has asked a question if I can talk about Judaism. See, Judaism is the founding religion for both Christianity and Islam. Judaism extends to at least 2000 to 3000 years before Christianity. So The way to understand Judaism is to understand the richness of spiritual practices that have been passed down from almost 4,000, 5,000 years. See, the way I have been able to understand Judaism is the core teachings of the founders. You cannot call them the founders of Judaism, but the founders of this new spirituality. People who discovered something within themselves. Abraham, Moses. Their teachings, and of course the teachings of other prophets, the compiled teachings is what you call the Torah. Well, of course, through the generations, there have been a lot of additions, deletions. There have been a lot of distortions to the actual book. And also the times when these teachings were propagated were very different. There was no secular law to protect people. So the teachings of the awakened beings, the teachings themselves became a moral code. And that is why the God of the Jews is a very angry God. He's a very jealous God. He's a God who gives commandments. See, that's the fundamental difference between the Christian God and the Jewish God. The Jewish God is about commandments and rules and practices. But of course, this would not have come from Moses himself, but it would have been added by people to control the populace. See, any scripture, be it Judaism, be it Christianity, be it Islam, be it Hinduism, you have to sift through the layers of human interpretations and human additions and deletions before you get to the core teachings. See, one thing that clearly emerges is Judaism was a purely mystical and very spiritual culture. And the language in which Judaism is spoken is in a mystical, poetic language. So you cannot understand the stories of the Torah by interpreting them literally. For example, you take the story of Genesis. It is a beautiful allegorical way of talking about the creation of man. And this was the fundamental difference between the Romans and the Jews. The Romans came from a culture of absolute literalism. For Romans, Logos was their God. For Jews, it is impossible to even imagine that logic can be God. And this cultural clash is what led to the death of Christ. Because Christ was a Jew. He studied the Jewish scriptures, he understood the scriptures, and of course, he was not a part of the mainstream Judaism. He was a part of a community called the Essenes, who were the mystical sect of Judaism. See, of course, any religion, any culture, if you give it 1,000 years or 2,000 years, it branches off into one mainstream culture and smaller independent mystical divisions, because mystical divisions cannot be mainstream. It cannot be for everybody. So only those individuals who are associated with the mystical groups start exploring the deeper dimensions of spirituality. So the Essenes withdrew themselves from the world. They understood the nature of the human being from within. They started practicing meditation, and the collection of their teachings was the mystical language of the Torah. Of course, when they brought in Jesus into the story of the Torah, of course, if you look at the Bible is almost 90% Torah. The Genesis, the Deuteronomy, the Psalms, the Proverbs, they've all been passed down from last 3,000, 4,000 years as a part of the Jewish culture. Since Romans had no understanding of this mystical tradition, they could not interpret the teachings of the Torah. They interpreted it quite literally, and that is what became Christianity. That is why the Bible seems to be extremely contradictory when you read different sections of the Bible because of this literal interpretation. Jewish culture Once upon a time, it was a pure mystical dimension of spirituality. And you can understand the mystical dimension of Judaism if you read the Kabbalah. And of course, you cannot read the Kabbalah, you'll have to understand it and you'll have to experience the mystery of these teachings.